Section 15 of The Pastor's Wife by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 15. He ceased to be revived. He smoked in silence. The effect on her of Italy was as surprising as it was unexpected. At Kökensee she had been entirely concentrated on him, eagerly listening only to him, drinking in only what he said, worshipping. Here she seemed possessed by a rage for any sights and sounds merely because they were new. There had been moments from the very start in Berlin when he almost felt of secondary interest, and they appeared to be becoming permanent. It was disturbing, it was incredible, it was grotesque. Perhaps it would be as well to take her away from the lakes, from all that part of the country which apparently caught her imagination on its most sensitive side. Perhaps Milan for a while, with pavements and museums. "Please, will you give me some of that money?" she asked across his reflections. "Which money?" he said, looking at her. "My money." "What on earth for?" "I want to send Robert a picture postcard." He threw his cigarette away. "It would be most improper," he said, passing his hand rapidly over his hair. "Highly improper." "Improper?" she echoed, staring at him. "To send Robert a picture postcard? Grossly it simply isn't done." "What?" "Not send Robert, but he'd like to see where we've got to." "For heaven's sake, don't talk about Robert," he exclaimed, getting up quickly. The idea of the picture postcard profoundly shocked him. "Not talk about him?" she repeated, staring at him in astonishment. "But he's my husband." "Exactly. That's what makes him so improper." "What?" "Why, I thought husbands were just the very thing that never could be improper." "Ingeborg," he said, walking angrily up and down in front of her, "are you or are you not being taken care of on this holiday by me? Are you or are you not travelling with me?" "Yes, I know, but I don't see why I shouldn't send "Well, then if you don't see you must believe. You've just got to believe me when I tell you certain things are impossible." "But Robert—" "Good heavens, don't talk of Robert. If I beg you not to, if I tell you it spoils things for me, if I ask you as a favour—" He stopped in front of her. "My dear, my little mate, my everything that's central and alive among the husks. Of course I won't then." "At least I'll try to remember not to," she said, looking at him with a smile that had effort in it as well as surprise. "But I don't see why a picture postcard—" The steamer they had seen for so long, the last one of the day from Arona to Locarno, was nearing the pier, and the piazza suddenly swarmed with busy groups preparing to go on it or see each other off. "Let's come away," said Ingram impatiently. "Let's come away," he repeated with a stamp of his foot. "I hate this crowd." She got up and walked beside him towards the hotel, her eyes on the ground. "I really can't see why I shouldn't send Robert," she began. "Oh, damn Robert!" he exclaimed violently. She looked at him. "Damn Robert?" she echoed, immensely surprised. "But don't you like Robert?" "No," said Ingram. "No," he said even louder. "Not here. Not now. Now don't," he added in extreme irritation as he saw her mouth opening. "Ask me why. Don't ask me to explain. Go to bed, Ingeborg. It's time all children under 10 were in bed. And get up early, please, because we're going to start the first thing for somewhere else." Chapter 34. Ingram was not only a great painter, he was practised in minor accomplishments, and among them was the art of running away. He had done it several times and had attained fluency. Indeed, so easy had practice made it that it grew to be hardly running so much as walking. He walked away, at last, quite leisurely, from an uncommenting wife to a lady whose affection for him was invariably already so great that there was nothing left for it to do but to decline, and when it had declined, assisted and encouraged in various ways by him, the chief cooling factor being his expressed impatience to get to his painting again undisturbed by non-essentials, each lady found it cooling to be called a non-essential. He avoided the part that is sometimes a little difficult, the part in which recriminations are apt to gather like clouds about a sunset, the part that lies round ends, by skilful treatment, by a gradual surrounding of her, who was now not so much a lover as a patient, with an atmosphere of affection for her home. She came by imperceptible degrees to thirst for her home. She came to thirst, and such was his skill that she thirsted healthily for her husband, or her father, or whoever it was she had left, for worries, catastrophes, disgrace, for anything, so long as it was so obliging as not to be love. If poorer in other ways, she departed at least richer in philosophy, without a trace of jealousy of what he might do next, not minding what he did if only she did not have to do it too, and he, until such time as he again was lured from paths of austerity and work by the hope that he had found the one predestined mate, enjoyed the condition in which he was altogether happiest, the freedom of spirit that disdains love. But how different from those comfortable excursions, as straightforward and as uneventful to him in their transitory salubrious warming as bread and milk, was this running away. It was distressingly different. Almost, except that he had no desire to laugh, ridiculously different. The first step, the process of the actual removal from Kökensee to Berlin, from legality to illicitness, had in its smoothness been positively glib, and he had supposed that, once alone together, love-making, which was the very marrow of running away, else why run, would follow with similar glibness. Nothing, however, seemed less inclined to follow. The only things that did follow were two confused, exasperating days in which his moods varied with every hour, almost at last with everything she said. The capaciousness of her beliefs and acceptances amazed him. They were as capacious as her enthusiasms. She believed so firmly what he had told her over there away in Kökensee, where of course a man had to say things in order to get a beginning made, about the friendly frequent journeyings of other people, she had so heartily accepted his assurance that it was absurd and disgraceful in its suggestion of evil-mindedness not to travel frankly anywhere with anybody. "Are we not children of light, you and I?" he had asked her. The things a man says, he thought. But they should not be brought up against him in this manner, clad in an invincible armour of acceptance, and shall we be hindered in our free comings and goings by the dingy scruples of those heavy others, the groping and afraid children of darkness? That plainly the idea that she was doing anything even remotely wrong had not occurred to her. The basis of her holiday was this belief in frank companionship. She had no difficulty, he observed, himself infinitely fretted by this constant closeness to her, in being just a frank companion. She was so carelessly secure in friendship, so empty of any thought beside, that she could and did say things to him which, said by any other woman in the same situation, would have instantly led to love-making. But Ingram, who was fastidious, could no more make love to her, violently begin, robustly stand no nonsense, so long as she was steeped in obliviousness, than he could to a child or a chair. There must be some response, some consciousness. Her obtuseness to the real situation was so terribly healthy-minded that it was almost a disease. The awful candour of soul of bishops' daughters and pastors' wives appalled him. For 3 days the weather continued heavy, pressing down on his eyes. He did not sleep. He was all nerves. In the morning, a time he had not yet known her in, for at Kökensee they were together only in the afternoons, she produced the effect on him of someone different and in some subtle annoying way strange. Was it because she flickered more in the mornings? He could not describe it better than that. She flickered. She always flickered mentally, her thoughts just giving each subject a little lick and then blowing off it to something else. But in the afternoons and evenings the flickering was often beautiful, or at those warmer, more indulgent hours it seemed so, and in the morning it was not. A man in the morning wants somebody pinned down for a companion, somebody reasonable and fixed, nothing but a rather silent reasonableness, and if enunciations are unavoidable, brief ones go well with coffee and with rolls. At breakfast he found he could hardly speak to her, so exceedingly then was she on his nerves. Her dreadful healthy restedness when he had been tossing all night, her fearful readiness for the new day when he had not even begun to recover from the old one, her regularity of enthusiasm, her punctual happiness, and every evening he was in love with her. He was exasperated. This being with her among the hills and lakes of Italy that he had thought of as going to be the sweetest time he had known was sheer exasperation. For even in the evenings, when he was in love with her, the condition indeed set in at any time from tea onwards, and could on occasion be induced before tea if she happened to say the right things, he was irritably in love, and hardly knew whether it would give him more satisfaction to shake her or to kiss her. And annoying and perplexing as her untroubled conscience was, it was yet not so annoying and perplexing as her wild joy in Italy. Who would not be galled by the discovery that he had become a background? Who would have supposed that she who in Kökensee thought him so wonderful, so clearly realized who he was, who walked with him there in the rye fields and offered him every sort of incense that sweet words could invent, would, let loose in Italy, take the background he had so carefully chosen for his love-making and hug it to her heart and be absorbed in it and adore it beyond reason, and that he himself would turn into the background, incredible as it seemed, into just the background of his own background. When he took her up into the hills, into solitary places where the chestnut woods went on for miles and no one ever came but charcoal burners, he was not, as it were, there. When he took her on the lake in a sailing boat, and they hung motionless on the good will of the wind, he was not there either. When they rested after a hot climb, deep in some high meadow not yet reached by the ascending haymakers, and through the stalks of its bee-haunted flowers, its delicate bending scabious and frail ragged robins could see little bits of lake far below, and the white villages on the mountains opposite, and the whole world was only asking to be made a frame of for love, where, he inquired of himself, in the picture that was in her mind and irradiating her eyes, was he. He had not imagined, so far behind him were his own discoveries of the new, that anyone could be so greedily absorbed. Watching her while she watched everything except him, he decided he would take her to Milan. He would try something ugly. Milan, this heavy hot weather, ought to give her back to him, if anything would. They would stay in a street where there were tram-cars and noises, and they would frequent museums. They would walk much on pavements, and have their food in English tea-rooms. While the cure was in progress, she might be getting herself some decent clothes, for really her clothes were distressing. And when it was accomplished, and she was thoroughly bored with things and had come back to being aware of him, he would carry her off to Venice and begin work. Work, the best thing in life, the one thing that keeps on yet is never monotonous, the supreme thing always new and joyful. But he was afraid of Venice. Venice was too beautiful. She would not sit quiet there while he painted her. She would want to go out and look. Impossible to take her there until she had learned to blot out everything in the world with his image alone. This blotting out, he perceived, would have to be achieved in Milan, and quickly. He was starving for his work. So acute was his hunger to begin the great picture that right underneath all his other emotions and wishes and moods was a violent impatience at being kept from it by what his subconsciousness alluded to with resentful incorrectness as a parcel of women. It was the evening at Luino that he definitely decided on Milan. They had walked that day along the wooded paths that led ultimately across to Ponte Tresa, and she had once again, on returning to Luino and seeing a revolving column of picture postcards outside a tobacconist's shop, and catching sight of some that showed the place of rocks and falling water in which they had eaten their luncheon, wanted to send one to Robert. She had not said so, but she had hovered round the column looking hungry. Picture postcards seemed to have a dreadful fascination for her. And as for Ingram, the mere sight of them at this point of their journey made him see red. He had instantly observed her hungry hovering, and had flared out into a leaping rebuke in which there was more of the angry schoolmaster than the lover. He had felt it himself, and seen, quick as he was to see, a little look of surprised and questioning fear for a moment in her eyes. "Well, it's because you're always thinking of Robert," he flashed at her in an attempt that caught fire on the way to apologize. "Not always," she said hesitatingly, with a smile that for the first time was propitiating. And the accidents of the pavement making him walk for a few yards in front of her, she found herself looking at his back, his high thin shoulders, and the rims of his ears, with a startled feeling of entire strangeness. A dim thought rose and disappeared again somewhere in the back of her mind. A whisper of a thought, hardly breathed, and gone again. "I'm used to Robert." He took her to Milan next day. That loud and sweltering city was, by its hot dullness, to bore her into awareness of him, to toss her by sheer elimination of other interests to his breast. Inexorably he kept her on the steamer, and turned a deaf ear to her prayers that they might land when it stopped at attractive villages on its journey down the lake. She thought this unreasonable, for why come at all to these lovely places, come so close that one could almost touch them, and then whisk away and hardly let one look? And she could not help feeling, after he had been short with her about the Borromean Islands, at one of which unfortunately the steamer touched, that it would be both blessed and splendid to travel round here alone, free, able to get out at islands if one wanted to. "Yes, those are islands," he said, when first they loomed on her enraptured gaze. "Yes, one can land on them, but we're not going to. Yes, yes, beautiful, but we've got to catch the train." She began to turn a slightly perplexed attention to him. Surely he was different from what he was at Kökensee. And there were the Borromean Islands slipping away. the beautiful islands. There they were being passed, going out of her life. It was unlikely she would ever see them again. To Ingram, on that leaden afternoon, the lake looked like a coffin, and the islands as dull and shabby as three nails in it. To Ingeborg they looked like three little miracles of God, just as he who for the first time goes abroad would give up Rome if he might stop at Calais. So did Ingeborg hanker after detailed exploration of new places she was inexorably whisked away from. The Borromean Islands were beautiful, but if they had been dull she still would have hankered after them. Beautiful or dull, they were different from Kökensee, and when the travelled Ingram put his hopes in Milan he did not realize how great on Ingeborg, after her strictly cloistered Kökensee existence, was the effect of the merely different. The platform at Arona, the flat fields the train presently lumbered across, the factories and suburbs of Milan, the noisy streets throbbing heavily with heat, that grey and lowering afternoon, the shapes of things, of dull things, of tram-cars and cabs and washerwomen, the shop windows, the behaviour and foreign faces of dogs, the behaviour of children, the Italian eyes all turned to her, all staring at her. They fascinated and absorbed her like the development of a vivid dream. Who were these people? What would they all do next? What were they feeling, thinking, saying? Where were they going? What had they had for breakfast? What were the rooms like they had just come out of? What sorts of things did they keep in their cupboards? "If one of them would lend me a cupboard," she exclaimed to Ingram, "and leave me alone with what it has got inside, I believe I'd know all Italy by the time I'd done with it. Everything, everything. The desires of its soul and its body, and what it works at and plays at and eats, and what it hopes is going to happen to it after it is dead." And he had been supposing, from her silence as she walked beside him, that she was finding Milan dull. Hastily he led her away from the streets into an English tea-room, and made her sit with her back to the window, and gave her rusks. But though her childhood had been spent among these objects, which were esteemed at the Palace because falling just short at the last moment of quite sweetness and quite niceness they discouraged sinful gorging, they had none of their ancient sobering effect on her there in Milan. She ate them, and remained as brightly detached from them as before. Their dryness choked out none of her lively interest. Their reminiscent flavour did not quiet her, not even when combined, as it presently was, with the sound of church bells floating across the roofs. She might have been in Redchester, with those Sunday bells ringing and all the rusks. Sitting opposite to her at the marble-topped table in the deserted shop, Ingram decided he would give her no meals more amusing than this in Milan. So long as she kept him there she should, except breakfast, have all her meals in that one place. Modest meals, meals damping to the spirits, and surely in the long run lowering, the most inflaming dish provided by the tea-room being, it announced on its wall, poached eggs. He kept her there as long as he could, long after the tea was cold, and tried, so deeply upset was he becoming by the delays her curious immaturity was causing in the normal development of running away, actually in that place of buns to make love to her. But how difficult it was. He, too, had eaten rusks. He wanted to tell her he adored her, and it reached her across the teapot in the form of comments on the uncertainties of her behaviour. He wanted to tell her Her body was as delicate as flowers and delightful as dawn, and it came out a criticism of the quality, also the quantity, of her enthusiasms. He endeavoured to sing the praise of the inmost core of her, the inexpressible, illuminating, understanding, and wholly sweet core, and instead he found himself acidly deprecating her clothes. Ingeborg sat listening with half an ear, and eyes bright with longing to be out in the streets again. She was fidgeting to get away from the shop, and was sorry he should choose just that moment to smoke so great a number of cigarettes. Even the young lady who guarded the cakes appeared to think the visit, for one based only on tea and rusks, had lasted long enough, and came and cleared away and inquired in English, it being her native tongue, whether she could not now get them anything else. "The curious admixture in you," said Ingram, starting out with the intention of comparing her to light in the darkness and immediately getting off the rails, "the curious admixture in you of streaks of childishness and spasmodic maturity. You are at one moment so entirely impulsive and irresponsible, and a moment before you were quite intelligent and reasonable, and a moment afterwards you are splendid in courage and recklessness." "When was I splendid in courage and recklessness?" she asked, bringing more attention to bear on him. "When you left your home to come to me. The start off was splendid. Who could dream it would fizzle out into, well, into this? But has it fizzled out? You're not," she leaned across the table a little anxiously, "you're not scolding me? On the contrary, I'm trying to tell you all you are to me." "Oh," said Ingeborg, "I intend somehow to isolate my consciousness of your streaks." "Streaks?" "As beeswax up a dead invader." "Oh, a dead invader?" "I don't, you see, believe in the damning effects of one specific outbreak, nor of one or two. You're not really scolding me?" she asked again, a little anxiously. "On the contrary, I'm believing in and clinging to your dear innermost." "Oh," said Ingeborg. "I believe these streaks and patches and spots your superficial self has may be good in their ultimate effect, may save us by interrupting from those two serene spells that dog's ear love with usage and carelessness." She gazed at him, her mouth a little open. He lit yet another cigarette. "But it's rather like," he said, flinging the match away into the corner whither the young lady followed it and with a pursed reproachfulness trod it out, "it's rather like finding a crock of gold in one's garden and only being able to peep at it sometimes, and having to go away and work very hard for 11 shillings a week." She went on gazing at him in silence. "And not even for 11 shillings," said Ingram, reflecting on all he had already endured. "Work very hard for nothing." She leant across the table again. "I never mean to be tiresome," she said. "Little star," he said stoutly. "It's always involuntary, my tiresomeness," she said, addressing him earnestly. "Oh, but it's so involuntary, and the dull surfaces I know I have, and the scaly imperfections." He knocked the ashes off his cigarette with unnecessary vigour, almost as though they were bits of an annoying relative's body. "I'm warped and encrusted and blundering," went on Ingeborg, who was always thorough when it came to adjectives. In his irritable state, to have her abjectly cheapening herself vexed him as much as everything else she had done that day had vexed him. He might, under provocation, point out her weaknesses, but she must not point them out to him. He wanted to worship him, and she persisted in preventing him. Distressing to have a God who refuses to sit quiet on its pedestal, who insists on skipping off it to show you its shortcomings, and beg your pardon. How could he make love to her if she talked like this? It would be like trying to make love to a prayer book. "Is it because it's Sunday," he said, "that you are impelled to acknowledge and confess your faults? You make me feel as if a verger had passed by and pushed me into a pew." "Well, but I am warped and encrusted and blundering," she persisted. "You are not," he said irritably. "Haven't I told you you are my star and my miracle?" "Yes, but—" "I tell you," he said, determined to believe it, "that you are the very bath of my tired spirit." "How kind you are," she said. "You're as kind to me as if you were my brother. Sometimes I think you are rather like my brother. I never had a brother, but you're very like, I think, the one I would have had if I had had one." She warmed to the idea. "I feel as if my brother—" she said, preparing to launch into enthusiasm, but he interrupted her by getting up. "It seems waste," he said, reaching for his hat, "to talk about your brother, as you've never had him. Shall we go?" She jumped up at once with the air of one released. He himself could not any longer endure the tea room, or he would have stayed in it. Gloomily he went out with her into the streets again, and noted that if anything she seemed more active and eager than before, thoroughly indeed rested and refreshed. Gloomily he realised during the next hour or two that she had an eye for buildings, and that they were always the wrong ones. Gloomily he discovered an odd liking in her for anything, however bad, that was wrought in iron. He could not get her past some of the iron gates of the palaces. He hated bad gates. Without experience she could not compare and did not select, and her interest was all-embracing, indiscriminating as a child. He took pains to avoid the Piazza del Duomo, but by some accident of a twisting street and momentary inattentiveness he did find himself at last, after much walking as he had thought away from it, all of a sudden facing it. Urging her on by her elbow, he hurried her nervously across it, hoping she would not see the cathedral. But the cathedral being difficult not to see, she did see it, and remained, as he had feared she would, rooted. "Ingeborg," he exclaimed, "if you tell me you like that—" "Oh, let me look, she cried, holding his sleeve while he tried to get her away. "It's so funny. It's so different." "Ingeborg," he almost begged. But from its outside to its inside was an inevitable step, and that she should gasp on first getting in seemed also, after she had done it, inevitable. Ingram found himself sightseeing, looking at windows, following her down vaults towed by beadles. He rubbed his hand violently over his hair. "But this is intolerable," he cried aloud to himself. "I shall go mad." And he strode after her and caught her arm just as she was disappearing over the brim of the crypt. "Ingeborg," he said, his eyes blazing at her in a bright astonishment, "do you mean to tell me that I shall not reach you? That I'm not going to get ever at you till I paint you?" She turned in the gloom and looked up at him. "Oh, I know I'll get you then," he said on excitedly, while the interrupted beadle impatiently rattled his keys. "Nothing can hide you away from me then. I don't paint, you see, by myself." She stared up at him. "And all this you're doing, all this waste of running about, have you then forgotten the picture?" It was as though he had shaken her suddenly awake. She stared at him in a shock of recollection. Why, of course, the picture! Why, incredible, but she had forgotten it. Actually forgotten it in the wild excitement of travelling. Actually she had been wanting to linger at each new place. She who had only 10 days altogether, she who had come only after all because of the picture, the great picture, the first really great thing that had touched her life. And here she was with him, its waiting creator, dragging him about who held future beauty in his cunning guided hand among all the mixed stuff left as a burden on the generations by the past, curious about the stuff with an uneducated, stupid curiosity, wasting time, ridiculously blocking the way to something great, to the greatest of the achievements of a great artist. She was sobered, she was overcome by the vivid recognition of her cheap enthusiasm. "Oh," she said, staring up at him, wide awake, entirely ashamed, "how patient you've been with me." And as he still held her by the arm, his eyes blazing down at her from the top step of the crypt, she could find no way of expressing her shame and contrition except by bending her head and laying her cheek on his hand. Chapter 35. They stood there for what seemed to the beadle at the bottom an intolerable time, the lady, evidently nobody certificated, with her cheek on the gentleman's hand, and he himself, as honest a man as ever wanted to get his tip and be done with it, kept waiting with nothing to do but curse and rattle his keys. And though it was summer, the crypt was cold, and so would his feet be soon. And what could the world be coming to when people carried their caressings even into crypts? Becoming maddened by these delays, the beadle cursed them both, their present, past, and future, roundly and thoroughly, and also profanely, for by the accident of his calling he was very perfect in profanity beneath his breath. "I'm so sorry, Ingeborg was murmuring, who did nothing by halves, neither penitence, nor humility, nor gratitude. "My worshipped child," whispered Ingram, immensely moved by this swift change in her, and changed as swiftly himself by the softness of her cheek against his hand. "Oughtn't we to go to Venice to-night?" she asked, still standing in that oddly touching attitude of apology. "Not to-night. But how can a picture get painted in just that little time?" "Ah, but you know I'm good at pictures." "But I can't stay a minute longer than Thursday. I have to be back on Saturday at the very latest." "You'll see. It will all be quite easy." "But to think that I forgot the picture," she said, looking up at him shocked, while the ancient humility in which the Bishop had so carefully trained her descended on her once more, only fourfold this time, like a garment grown voluminous since last it was put on. They had, for some reason, been talking in murmurs, and the embittered beadle, losing his self-control, began to say things audibly. Strong in the knowledge of tourist ignorance when it came to real language in Italian, he said exactly what he thought, and what he thought was so monstrous, so inappropriate to beadles and to the atmosphere of a crypt, besides being so extremely and personally rude, that it roused Ingram, who knew Italian almost better than the beadle, for his included scholarly byways in vituperation, strange and curious twists beyond the reach of the uneducated, to pour a sudden great burning blast of red-hot contumely down on his head. And having done this he turned, and holding Ingeborg's hand, led her up the steps again, leaving the beadle at the bottom, solitary, shrivelled, and singed. They thought no more of crypts and beadles. They looked neither to the right nor to the left. Ingram held her by the hand all the way down the cathedral and the piazza, when they came out on to it with its crowds of vociferating men and bell-ringing tramcars and sellers of souvenirs, seemed to Ingeborg nothing now but a noisy irrelevance. Whole strips of postcards were thrust unnoticed into her face. The purpose of her journey was the picture, marvellous that she should have lost sight of it, and of the wonder and pride of being needed for it. Needed at last for anything, she who so profoundly had longed to be needed, but needed for this as a collaborator actually, even though passive and humble, in the creation of something splendid. He put her into a cab and drove with her away from the fuss and din. She was exquisite again to him, adorable altogether. The memory of the fret and hot irritation of the day was wiped out, as though it had never been, by that other memory of her sweet apology on the steps of the crypt. He told the driver, for it was towards evening, to take them to those gardens described by the guide book as probably the finest public park in Italy. And presently, as they walked together in the remoter parts, the dusk dropped down like a curtain between them and the Sunday night crowd collecting round the fountains. Tall trees and clumps of box and rose bushes shut out everything except mystery, and she in that quiet place of trickling water and dim flowers began again to talk to him as she had talked at Kökensee, softly, deliciously, and about nothing except himself. It was like the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. It was infinite refreshment and relief. She talked about the picture with reverence, adoringly. She told him how, in the rush of new impressions, she had been forgetting everything that really mattered, not only that greatest of them all, but the other things she had to thank him for besides. Italy, her unexpected holiday, due so entirely to him. She said, her husky voice softer than ever with gratitude, "You have been giving me happiness and happiness. You've heaped happiness on me with both your hands," she said, reaching only for words that should be sweet enough. "Do you know, I could cry to think of it all, of all you've been to me since you came to Kökensee. When I'm back there again, this time with you, will be like a hidden precious stone, and when I'm stupid and thinking that life is dull, I'll get it out and look at it, and it will flash colour and light at me." "When you talk like that," said Ingram, greatly stirred, "it is as though a little soul had come back into a deserted and forgotten body." "Is it?" she murmured, so glad that she could please him, perfectly melted into the one desire to make up. "When you talk like that," he said, "life becomes a thing so happy that it shines golden inside. You have the soul I have always sought, the thing that comes through me like light through a stained glass window, so that I am lit, so that my heart is all sweet fire." "And you," said Ingeborg, picking up his image as she so often irritatingly did, only now it did not irritate him, and flinging it back with a fresh adornment, "the thought of you, the memory of you, when I've gone back to my everyday life, will be like a perfect rose window in a grey wall. As though we could be separated again. As though being in love with somebody miles away isn't just intolerable ache. Oh, my dear, why do you look at me?" he asked, with a large simplicity of manner that made her ashamed of her surprise. "Because I talk of being in love? Why shouldn't two people simply love each other and say so? And if I love you, it isn't with the greedy possessive love I've had for women before, but as though the feeling one has for the light on crystals, or for the clear shining after rain, the feeling of beauty in deep and delicate things, has become personified and exalted." She made a little deprecating gesture. He was almost too kind to her. Too kind. But nobody could reasonably object to being loved like crystals and clearness after rain. Robert couldn't possibly mind that. She cast about for things to say back, shining things to matches, but he found them all first. It was impossible to keep up with him. "You are delicate and fine, like translucent gold," he said. "And you are brave and various and alive. And you are full of sweet little fancies, little swirls of mood, kind, eager things. Never in my life is there the remotest chance that I shall meet so good and deep a happiness as you again. And I put my heart once and for all between your dear, cool little hands." She felt bent beneath this generosity. She who had been so tiresome, and not only tiresome, but she who had had doubts, unworthy ones she now saw, round about breakfast time, for instance, piercing through her silly delight in Italy as to whether she was giving even any satisfaction. "I perceive," he went on, "I've never really loved before. I've played with dolls and expressed myself to dummies, like a boy with a ball he must play with, and failing a playfellow he bumps it against a wall and catches it again. But you play back, my living dear heart." More and more was she invaded by a happy surprise. The things she had been doing without knowing it! All the right ones apparently the whole time, playing back, coming up to his expectations, and moments such as those at the Borromean Islands, and when there were picture postcards, and just recently in the tea room, had not in the least been what she supposed. She had not understood. She glowed to think that she had not understood. "I've been so wearied and distressed with life," he went on, talking in a low moved voice. "It has seemed at last such an old hairy thing of jealousies and shame and disillusionments, and work falling short of its best, and endless coming and going of people, and me for ever left with a blunted edge. And now you come, you, and are like a great sweet wind blowing across it, and like clear skies and a moon rising before sunset. It is as though you had taken up a brush and painted out the old ugly tangles and made a new picture of me in luminous clear watercolour." Her surprise grew and grew, and her gladness that she had been mistaken. Those streaks, she thought, he didn't really mean what he said about those streaks. "Somehow, though quite intelligent all along," continued Ingram, "I've been shallow and hard in my feelings about everything. Now I feel love like a deep soft river flowing through my heart. I love every one because I love you. I can set out to make people happy. I can do and say fine and generous things because of the love of you shining in my heart." That beetle, she thought, he didn't really mean what he said to that beetle. "You're what I've been looking for in women all my life," he went on. "You're the dream come true. I've only tried to love before, and now you've come and made me love, which we all dream of doing, and giving me love, which we all dream of getting." Her pleasure became tinged with a faint uneasiness, for she wouldn't have thought, left to herself, that she had been giving him love. Pastors' wives didn't give love except to their pastors. Friendship, yes, she had given him warm friendship and an abject admiration of his gifts and pride and gratefulness, oh, such pride and gratefulness, that he should like being with her and saying lovely things to her. But love? She had supposed love was reserved for lovers. Well, if he liked to call it love, one must not be missish. It was very kind of him. It was also more and more wonderful to her that she had been doing and being and giving all these things without knowing it. Her suddenly discovered accomplishments staggered her. "Is it possible," she thought with amazement, "that I'm clever?" And as if he had heard the word Lovers in her mind, he said it. Other lovers, he said, are engaged perpetually in sycophantic adaptations. In what? She thought he was going to say engaged to be married, for though she had known even in Redchester, in spite of the care taken to shut such knowledge out, that the world included wicked persons who loved without engagements or marriages, sometimes indeed even without having been properly introduced, persons who were afterwards punished by the correctly plighted by not being asked to tea. They were, the Bishop informed an anxious inquirer once when he had supposed her out of the room, in God's infinite mercy, numerically negligible. But Ingram did not heed her. "Except us," he went on. "Us?" she echoed. "Well, if one took the word in its widest sense. We fit," he said, "we fit and reflect each other. I in your heart, you in my heart, like two mirrors that hang opposite one another for ever." A doubt as to the expediency of so much talk of hearts and love crept into her mind, but she quieted it by remembering how much worse the Song of Solomon was. "And yet so respectable, really," she said, continuing her thought aloud, "and all only about the church." "What is so respectable? Come and sit on that seat by the bush covered with roses," he said. "Look, in this faint light they are as white and delicate as you. The Song of Solomon, it just happened to come into my head. Things do," she added, beginning to lay hold of the first words that occurred to her, no longer at her ease. She sat down on the edge of the seat where he put her. "It's stone," she said nervously, looking up at him, for he had taken a step back and was considering her, his head on one side. "Do you think it's good for us?" "You beautiful little thing," he murmured, considering her. "You exquisite little lover." Her hands gripped the edge of the seat more tightly. A sudden, very definite longing for Robert seized her. "Oh, but," she began, and faltered. She tried again. "It's so kind of you, but, you know, but I don't think—" "What don't you think, my dear, my discoverer, my creator, my restorer?" "Oh, I know there was Solomon," she faltered, holding on to the seat, "saying things too, and they meant something else, but isn't this different? Different because, well, I suppose through my not being the church. I'm very sorry," she added apologetically, "that I am not the church, because then I suppose nothing would really matter?" "You mean you don't want me to call you lover?" "Well, I am married," she said, in the voice of one who apologized for drawing its attention to it. "There is no getting away from that." "But we have got away from it," said Ingram, sitting down beside her and loosening the hand nearest him from its tight hold on the seat and kissing it, while she watched him in an uneasiness and dismay that now were extreme. "That's exactly what we have done. Oh," he went on, kissing her hand with what seemed to her a quite extraordinary emotion, "you brave, beautiful little thing, you must know, you can't not know, how completely and gloriously you have burned your ships." "Ships?" she echoed. She stared at him a moment, then added with a catch in her breath, "Which ships?" Ingeborg, my fastness, my safety, my darling, my reality, my courage," said Ingram, kissing her hand between each word. "Yes," she said, brushing that aside, "but which ships?" "My strength, my helper, friend, sister, lover, unmerited mate. Yes, but won't you leave off a minute? It would be convenient if you'd leave off a minute and tell me which ships." He did leave off to look into her eyes in the dusk, eyes fixed on him in a concentration of questioning that left his epithets on one side as so much irrelevant lumber. "Little worshipful thing," he said, still gripping her hand. "Did you really think you could go back? Did you really think you could? Go back where? To that unworthy rubbish heap, Kökensee." She stared at him. Their faces, close together, were white in the dusk, and their eyes looking into each other's were like glowing dark patches. "Why should I not think so?" she said. "Because, you little artist in recklessness, you have burned your ships." She made an impatient movement, and he tightened his hold on her hand. "Please," she said, "do you mind telling me about the ships? One of them was this." "Was what?" "Coming to Italy with me." "You said heaps of people." "Oh, yes, I know. A man has to say things." "And the other was writing that letter to Robert. If you'd left it at Boots and Berlin." He laughed triumphantly and kissed her hand again. "But that wouldn't have helped either, really," he went on, "because directly the 10 days were up and you hadn't come back, he'd have known." "Hadn't come back? Oh, Ingeborg, little love, little Parsifal among women, dear divine ignorance and obtuseness, I adore you for believing the picture could be done in a week." "But you said—" "Oh, yes, yes, I know. A man has to say things at the beginning." "What beginning?" "Of this, of love, happiness, all the wonders of joy we're going to have." "Please, do you mind not talking about those other things for a minute? Why do you tell me I can't go back, I can't go home?" "They wouldn't have you." "Isn't it ridiculous? Isn't it glorious?" "What? Not have me home? They wouldn't have me? Who wouldn't?" "There isn't a they. I've only got Robert." "He wouldn't. After that letter he couldn't. And Kökensee wouldn't and couldn't. And Glambeck wouldn't and couldn't. And Germany, if you like, wouldn't and couldn't. The whole world gives you to me. You're my mate now for ever." She watched him kissing her hand as though it did not belong to her. She was adjusting a new thought that was pushing its way like a frozen spear into her mind, trying to let it in, seeing she could not keep it out. Among all those happy thoughts so warmly there already about Ingram and her holiday and the kindness and beauty of life, without its too cruelly killing too many of them too quickly. "Do you mean—" she began. Then she stopped, because what was the use of asking him what he meant? Quite suddenly she knew. An immense slow coldness, an icy fog, seemed to settle down on her and blot out happiness, all the dear accustomed things of life, the small warm things of quietness and security, the everyday things one nestled up to and knew were sliding away from her. "So what?" she heard herself saying in a funny clear voice. "There's only God." "How only God?" he asked, looking up at her. "Only God left who wouldn't call it adultery." The word in her mouth shocked him. End of section 15. Section 16 of The Pastor's Wife by Elizabeth von Arnim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 16. Chapter 36. She sat quite still after that while he talked. After that one deplorable bald word she said no more at all. And Ingram's passionate explanations and asseverations only every now and then caught her ear. She was going home. That was all she knew and could think of. Back to Robert, away from Ingram, somehow, at once. Robert would turn her out. Ingram was saying so, she heard that. Robert might kill her. Ingram was saying so, she heard that too. He didn't say kill, he called it ill-using. But whatever it was, who cared? She would at least, she thought with a new grimness, be killed legitimately. She was going back to Robert, going to tell him she was sorry. Anyhow, that then he could do what he chose. But how to get to him? Oh, how to get to him? Her thoughts whirled. Ingram wouldn't let her go, but she was going. Ingram had her money, but she was going. That very night. Her thoughts, whirling and whizzing, went breathless here in dark, terrifying places. And while she was flying along on them like a leaf on a hurricane blast, Ingram was still kissing her hand, still pouring out phrases as he had been doing ever since, surely ever since time began. She stared at him, remembering him in a kind of wonder. She caught a word here and there. Pellucid, he was saying something was. Translucent. She felt no resentment. She had deserved all she had got. Not Ingram and what he had told her or not told her mattered, but Robert. How to reach Robert, how to get near enough to say to him, "See, I've come back, draggled and muddied. Everybody believes it. You'll believe it, though I tell you it's not true. And if you believe it or not, it's your ruin. You'll have to leave this place and all your work and hopes. Now kill me." A man, she heard Ingram going on, still passionately explaining what was so completely plain, must pretend things at the beginning to get his dear woman. Of course, nodded her thoughts in hurried agreement, rushing past him to the swift turning over of ways of reaching Robert. Who cared about dear women? How to hide from Ingram that she was going, how to keep him from suspecting her, from watching her every instant. A vision of herself in the restaurant car, handing him over the money she had, chaining herself of her own accord to him, rose for a moment, danced mockingly. It was so ludicrously important an action and at the same time so small and natural before her eyes. The chances of life, the way small simplicities worked out great devastations. She threw back her head in a brief, astonished laugh. Instantly Ingram kissed her throat. I, she gasped, getting up quickly. "It has been so hot all day," she said, with a little look of apologizing, remembering to gather her terror and misery tightly round her like a cloak, so that it should not touch him, so that he should not by so much as a flutter of it feel that it was there. For then he would watch her, and she gripped her hands together, would be lost. "I think I'm tired," she said. He became immediately all reasonableness, the kindly reasonableness of one who has cleared away much confusion and can now afford to wait. He got up, too, agreeing about the heat of the day, and reminding her also of its length, of the journeys by land and water it had contained, and of the inadequate meal of rusks that had been their sole support for nearly 6 hours. No wonder she was tired. He was tenderness and concern itself. "Poor little dear thing," he whispered, drawing her hand through his arm and holding it there clasped in his other hand as he led her away towards the entrance and went with her out into the streets again, making her walk slowly lest she should be more tired, restraining her when she tried to hurry. And seeing a cheerful restaurant with crowded tables on the pavement in front of it, he suggested that they should stop at it and have supper. But Ingeborg said in a low voice, kept carefully controlled, that she was afraid she would go to sleep over supper, she was so tired. Might she have some milk at the hotel and go to bed? His tenderness for her, as he conceded the milk, was nurse-like. But he, she murmured, he must have supper. Would he not send her back in a cab and stay here and have some? No, he would certainly not trust a thing so precious to some careless cabman. He would take her back to the hotel and then perhaps have food. But the hotel, she murmured, was so stuffy. Did he think he would like food there? Well, perhaps when she was safely in it he would come out again to one of these pavement places. She seemed more pliantly feminine as she went with quiet steps through the streets on his arm than he had yet known her. It was as though she had wonderfully been converted from boyhood to womanhood, smitten suddenly with womanhood there in those gardens, and every muscle of her mind and will had relaxed into a sweet fatigue of abandonment. He adored her like that, so gentle, giving no trouble, accepting the situation and his comfortings and his pattings of the hand on his arm and all his further explanations and asseverations with a grown-up, dear reasonableness he had not yet seen in her. In return he took infinite care of her, protective and possessive, whenever they came to a crowd or a puddle, and he stroked her hand and looked into her face, demanding and receiving an answering obedient smile. And he wanted her and asked her to lean heavily on his arm so that she should not be so tired. In a word, he was fond. They were staying at a hotel near the station, just off the station square down a side street, a place frequented by middle-class Italians and commercial travellers, noisy with passing tram-cars and of little promise in the matter of food. Ingram had taken rooms there that afternoon when the determination was strong upon him that Ingeborg in Milan should not be comfortable. Now he was sorry for the happy turn things had taken, the immense stride he had made in the direction of Venice by opening her eyes to the facts of the situation, made this excess of martyrdom unnecessary. But there they were, the rooms, engaged and unpacked in, on the first floor almost, on a level with the ceaseless passing tops of the bumping tram-cars, and it was too late that night to change. He felt, however, very apologetic now as he went with her up the dingy stairs to the door of her room, in case some too cheery commercial traveller should meet her on the way and dare to look at her. "It's an unworthy place for my little shining mate," he said, "but Venice will make up for it all. You'll love my rooms there, the spaciousness of them, and the sunset on the lagoons from the windows. Tomorrow we'll go." He searched her face as she stood in the crude top light of the corridor. Naturally she was tired after such a day, but he observed a further dimness about her, a kind of opaqueness, like that of a lamp whose light has been put out, and it afflicted him. The light would be lit again, he knew, and burn more brightly than ever, but it afflicted him that even for a moment it should go out. And swiftly glancing up and down the passage, he took both her hands in his and kissed them. "Little dear one," he said, "little sister, you do forgive me?" "Oh, but of course," said Ingeborg quickly, with all her heart. And she felt for a moment the acute desolation of life, the inevitable hurtings, the eternal impossibility, whatever steps one took, of not treading to death something that, too, was living and beautiful, this thing or that thing, one or the other. Her eyes, as she looked at him, were suddenly veiled with tears. Her thoughts stopped swirling round ways of escape, and very vivid was the perception that her escape, if she did succeed in it, was going to be from something she would never find again, from a light and a warmth, however fitful, and a greatness. If he had been her brother, she would have put her arms round him and kissed him. If she had been his mother, she would have solemnly blessed him. As it was, there was nothing to be done but the bleak banality of turning away into her room and shutting the door. She heard his footsteps going down the passage. She went to the window and saw him going down the street. There was not an instant to lose. She must find out a train now, while he was away, have that at least ready in her mind for the moment when she somehow got the money. First that, then think out how to get the money. She stole into the passage again. Stole, for she felt a breathless fear that in spite of his being so manifestly gone, he yet would hear her somehow if she made a noise and come back. Stole along it and down the stairs into the entrance hall, where hung enormously a giant time-table, conspicuous and convenient in a hotel that supplied no concierge to answer questions, and whose clientele was particularly restless. Nobody was in the hall. It was not an hour of arrival or departure, and the man in the green apron she had seen there before, who at odd moments became that which in better hotels is uninterruptedly a concierge, was nowhere to be seen either. She had to get on a chair. The trains to Berlin were so high up on the great sheet, and tremblingly she kept an eye on the street door, through whose glass panels she could see people passing up and down the street, and they in their turn could and did see her. Yes, there was a night train at 1:30. It came from Rome. Travellers might arrive by it. The hotel door would be open. Her thoughts flew. It got to Berlin at 6-something of the morning after the next morning. Suddenly the glass door opened, and she jumped so violently that she nearly fell off her chair, and she fled upstairs panic-stricken, without even looking to see if it were Ingram. Safe in her room, she was horrified at herself for such a panic. How was she going to do everything there was to be done if she were like that? She stood in the middle of the floor, twisting her hands. If in her life she had needed complete self-control and clear thinking and calm acting, she knew it was now. But how to keep calm and clear when her body was shaking with fear? She felt, standing there struggling with herself, so entirely forlorn, so entirely cut off from warmth and love, so horribly with nothing she could look back to and believe in, and nothing she could look forward to and hope in, that just to speak to somebody, just to speak to a stranger who because he was a stranger would have no prejudices against her, would simply recognize a familiar distress, for surely the other human beings in the hotel must all at some time have been unhappy, seemed a thing of comfort beyond expressing. Her longing was intolerable to get close for a moment to another human soul, to ask of it how it had fared when it too went down into the sea without ships, leaving its ships all burned behind it, and yet its business had inexorably been in deep waters. "Oh, haven't you been unhappy too?" she wanted to ask of it. "Haven't you sometimes been very unhappy? Dear fellow soul, please tell me, haven't you sometimes felt bitter cold?" But there was no one, there was no brotherhood in the world, except at the rare obvious moments of common catastrophes and deaths. She began to walk up and down the room. 1:30 that night was the hour of her escape, and somehow between now and then she must get the money. Perhaps by some chance he had left it in his room, forgotten in a moment of carelessness in the pocket of the coat he had changed when they arrived that afternoon. It was not likely, for he was, she had noticed, of an extreme neatness and care about all such things. He never forgot. He never mislaid. Still, there was the chance. She opened the door again, this time in deadly fear, for perhaps he would be coming back, not choosing after all to stay out there having supper. There was no one in the passage. His room, she knew, was farther down. She had seen him going into it, 4 doors down on the same side as hers. She went out and stood a moment listening, then began to walk along towards it with an air of unconcern, as though rightfully going down the corridor till she came to his door. Then, with her heart in her mouth, she bolted in. The lights from the street and the houses opposite shone in through the unshuttered window, and she could see into every corner of the shabby hotel bedroom, a reproduction of the one she was in herself, trailed over dingily by traces of hundreds of commercial travellers, and smelling memorially, as hers did too, of their smoke and their pomades. She was hot and cold with fear, guilty as a thief. His coat hung behind the door. She ran her trembling fingers over it. Not a thing in any of his pockets. Nowhere anything that she could see. His unpacking had been done with orderliness itself. Of course he would not forget his pocket-book. With a gasp that was almost relief, she slipped out of the room, shut the door quickly behind her, and assuming what she tried to hope was an unconcerned swagger, a sort of I am as good as you are air for the impressing of anyone she might meet, walked down the passage again. Just as she reached her door, Ingram appeared, hurrying up the stairs 2 steps at a time. She clutched hold of the handle of her door, suddenly unable to stand. I, she began. But he did not seem surprised to see her there. He was intent on something else. "Just think," he said, coming quickly towards her. "I left my pocket-book in my room full of notes the whole afternoon, lying in the drawer of the table. I wonder—" He hurried past her almost at a run. She got into her room somehow, feeling heaven had forsaken her. After a minute or two she heard him coming along again. He stopped at her door and called to her softly. "It's all right. It was still there. Wasn't it lucky?" "Very," said Ingeborg, but so faintly that he did not hear. "Good night, my little one," she heard him say. "Now I'm going out to get that supper." "Good night," said Ingeborg, again so faintly that he heard nothing. And after a pause of listening he went away. She tumbled down onto the bed. She felt sick. It was 10:15. She had 3 hours to wait. She knew what she was going to do, try to do. At 1 o'clock she would take off her shoes and go down the passage and see if his door were locked. He would be asleep. He must be asleep. She twisted about in the terror that smote her at the thought that he might perhaps not be asleep. "God does love me," she said to herself. "I am his child. Haven't I sinned and repented? Haven't I done all the things? He's bound to help me, to save me. It is the wicked he saves. I am wicked." Her heart stood still at the fearful thought that perhaps she had not yet been after all wicked enough, not wicked enough to be saved. People belonging to the other rooms began to come back to bed. Somebody in the next room sang while he was undressing, a gay Italian song, and presently he smoked, and the smoke came in under the door between her room and his. She lay in the dark, or rather in the lights and shadows of the uncurtained room, and every 2 or 3 minutes a tram-car passed and shut out other sounds. Ingram must have come in long ago. When it was midnight she got up and arranged her shoes and hat just inside the door so that she could seize them as she came back, supposing she had been successful, and rush on straight downstairs and out and to the station. All other thoughts were now lost in the intentness with which she was concentrated on what she had to do exactly next. She would not let herself look aside at the abyss yawning if she were not successful. She gripped hold of the thing she had to do, the getting of the money, and fixed her whole self on that alone. She lay down on the bed again, her hands clenched as though in them she held her determination. Once her thoughts did slip off to Robert, to the extreme desolation of what was waiting for her there, and tears came through her tightly shut eyelids. "It's what you've deserved," she whispered, struggling to stop them. "Yes, but he hasn't deserved it. Robert hasn't deserved it. You've ruined him." She was forced to go on. She shook off the unnerving thoughts. By her watch it was 1:15. She stood up and began to listen. The tramcars passed now only every 10 minutes. In between their passing the hotel was quiet. She would wait for the approach of the next one. In the stillness she could hear it coming a long way off. Then she would run down the passage in her stockinged feet to Ingram's door and open it just as the noise was loudest. An icy hand seemed holding her heart, so icy that it burned. She had not known she had so many pulses in her body. They shook her and shook her, great, heavy, hammering things. She crept to her door and opened it a chink. There was a dim light in the passage. She heard the distant rumbling of a tramcar. Now she must run. But she could not. She stood and shook. There it was, coming nearer, and not another for 10 minutes. She began to sob and say prayers. The tramcar struck its bell sharply. It had reached the corner of the piazza. It would be passing in another minute. She wrenched the door open and ran like a flying shadow down the passage, and just as the car was at its loudest, turned the handle of Ingram's door. It was not locked. She stood inside. The tramcar rumbled away into the distance. Ingram, she nearly wept for relief, was breathing deeply, was asleep. But how funny, she thought, after one terrified glance at him as he lay in the bar of light the street lamp cast on the bed, thinking with a top layer of attention while underneath she was entirely concentrated on the pocketbook. How funny to go to bed in one's beard. She stole over to the table and peered about frantically among the things scattered on it, saw nothing, began with breathless care to try to open its drawer noiselessly, listening all the while for the least pause in the breathing on the bed, and all the while with the foolish detached layer of thoughts running in her head like some senseless tune. Funny to go to bed in a beard, funny to sleep in a thing like that, funny not to take it off at night and hang it up outside the door with one's clothes and have it properly brushed. The drawer creaked as it opened. The regular breathing paused. She stood motionless, hit rigid with terror. Then the breathing began again, and after all there was nothing in the drawer. She looked round the room in despair. On the little table by his pillow lay his watch and handkerchief, nothing else. But in the table was a small drawer. She must look in that too. She must go over and look in that. But how to open it so close to his head without waking him? She crept across to it, stopping at each step, holding her breath. She waited and listened before daring to take another. The drawer was not quite shut, and the slight noise of pulling its chink a little wider did not interrupt Ingram's breathing. She put in her hand and drew out the pocketbook, drew out some notes, Italian notes, the first she found, a handful of them, pushed the pocketbook into the drawer again, and was in the act of turning to run when she was rooted to the floor. Ingram was looking at her. His eyes were open, and he was looking at her, sleepily, hardly awake, like one trying to focus a thought. She stood fascinated with horror, staring at him, not able to move, her hand behind her back, clutching the money. Then he put out his arm and caught her dress. "Ingeborg?" he said in a sleepy wonder, still half in the deep dreams he had come up out of. "You, my little angel love, you've come?" "Yes, yes," she stammered, trying to pull her dress away, wild with fear, flinging herself as usual in extremity on to the first words that came into her head. "Yes, yes, but I must go back to my room a minute, just 1 minute. Please let me go, just 1 minute. I've forgotten my toothbrush." And Ingram, steeped in the heaviness of the first real sleep he had had for nights, and only half awake, murmured with the happy foolish reasonableness of that condition, "Don't be long then, sweetest little mate," and let her go. Chapter 37. 2 days later the porter at the Meuk station beheld Frau Pastor Dremmel trying to open the door of a third-class compartment in the early afternoon train from Allenstein, and going to her assistance, there being no other passenger to distract him, was surprised to find she had no luggage. Yet only the week before, with his own hands, he had put in a trunk for her and labelled it Berlin. With the interest of a lonely man whose time is his own, he inquired whether she had lost it, and was surprised to find she did not answer. He then told her, or rather called after her, for she was moving away, that the pastoral carriage had not yet come for her, and was surprised again, for again she did not answer. He stood watching her, wondering what was wrong. He was too much accustomed to dilapidations and dirt in himself to see them in others, so that these outer signs of exhaustion and prolonged travelling escaped him. Puzzled, he shook his head as she disappeared through the station door. Then he remembered that the poor lady was an Engländerin, and was able to turn away calmed with the satisfaction of him who has found the right label and stuck it on. Meuk, as she passed through it, shook its head over her too, consoling itself when she returned no greetings, did not even seem to see greetings, with the same explanation and shrug. Engländerin, Robertlet and Ditti, walking along neatly to afternoon school, and suddenly aware of the approach down the street towards them of a disordered who not only did not stop but apparently did not see them, murmured to each other, being by now well instructed by their grandmother, the same explanation. Engländerin, Frau Dremmel, leaning on her window-sill to watch her charges safely round the corner, and lingering a moment in the mellow summer air, explained her daughter-in-law, who went by without a glance, walking conspicuously in the middle of the road with no parcel in her hand to legitimize her being out, and not so much as an umbrella to give her a countenance, just with empty ungloved hands hanging down, and a scandalous scarcity of hairpins, and her clothes all twisted, in the same brief manner. Engländerin, Baroness Glambeck, driving towards the town along the shade-flecked high road, bent on one of those errands of mercy that are forced at intervals upon the great, with a basket of the properties, principally home-made jam and mittens, at her feet, endeavoured, though vainly, to mitigate the shock she received on being cut by her own pastor's wife, and a pastor's wife producing curiously the effect of somehow being in tatters, by using the same word to the female dependent who accompanied her on these occasions, because somebody had to carry the jam. Engländerin, The very birds in the branches, being German birds, were no doubt singing it. The dogs, as they met her, scented misfortune and barked furiously, instantly detecting the alien, angered by her batteredness. Discovering nothing in her clothes, however diligently they sniffed that an honest German dog could care about, and when on a lonely stretch of the road she came to a tramp, instead of begging, he offered her a drink. The lane turning off to Kökensee was so lovely that afternoon, in the bright bravery of early summer, and so glanced and shone and darted with busy birds and insects, and the glory of young leaves in the sun, that the dingy human figure faltering along it seemed an indecency. In that vigorous world what place was there for blind fatigue? In that world of triumph what place for a failure? It was the sort of day that used to make Ingeborg's heart lift up. Now she saw nothing, felt nothing, except that the sand was deep. She began to cry presently because the sand was deep. It seemed to give way on purpose beneath her feet, try on purpose to make her stumble and not get home. The line of roofs up against the afternoon sky did not appear to come any nearer, and yet she kept on trying to get home. The tears fell down her face as she labored along. She was afraid she wouldn't get home in time before she had to leave off walking because she couldn't walk any farther. It seemed to her a dreadful thing that she who could walk so well should not be able to walk now and get home. And this white sand, how fine it was, how it slid away on each side of one's feet wherever one put them. And it got into one's shoes, and one couldn't stop and empty them for fear if one sat down one wouldn't be able to get up again, and then one wouldn't get home. Slower and more slowly she labored along. By the time she reached the steep part, just before the village, she was crawling like a hurt insect. She had forgotten to eat on the journey, and in Milan there had only been the rusks. The street was asleep, empty that fine afternoon, the inhabitants awake at work in the fields, and only the pig and the geese were visible in the parsonage yard. Luckily the gate in the wire netting fence that shut off the house and garden was not latched, for she could not have opened it, but would have stood there holding on to it and foolishly sobbing till some one came and helped. The least obstacle now would be a thing that in no way could be got over. The front door was shut, and sooner than go up the steps and try to get it open she went round the path to the side of the house where the lilacs grew and Robert's window was. That way she could reach the kitchen, whose door stood always open and was level with the garden. Robert would be out in his fields. She would go to his laboratory and wait for him. Nobody but Robert knew yet. She had come back before the end of her leave. His shame was not yet public property. If he just beat her, she thought, in a disinterested, weak way, and there was an end of it, wouldn't that do? Then no one need ever know, and he could stay on in Kökensee and go on with his work, and she wouldn't have ruined him. It was the thought of having ruined Robert that clove her heart in two. To have ruined him, when all her ambition and all her hope had been to make him so happy. Well did she know that a pastor whose wife had broken the seventh commandment would be driven out, would be impossibly scandalous in any parish, and her not having broken it was quite beside the point. It didn't matter what you didn't do so long as you looked as though you had done it. And if Robert killed her it wouldn't help him either. He would have done the only decent thing, as the Baroness and her son Hildebrand had said that time long ago, and avenged his honor in the proper German way. But there were drawbacks to avenging one's honor. One was illogically punished for doing it, and even though it were mild punishment, any punishment ended a pastor's career. She crept round the corner of the house. She was so tired that if she had to wait for him long in his laboratory she felt sure she wouldn't be able to keep awake. Well, if he came in and killed her while she was asleep, it would be for her the pleasantest thing. She was so very tired that it would be nice, she thought vaguely, to wake up afterwards and find oneself comfortably dead. But Robert was not in his fields. From the path beneath his window she could see his head, as she had seen it hundreds of times, bending over his desk. At the sight she stopped, and her heart seemed to shrink into quite a little, scarcely beating thing. There he was, her dishonoured husband, the being who in her life had been kindest to her, had loved her most, still working, still going on doggedly among the ruins she had created, up to the last moment when public opinion, brutal and stupid, making her the chief thing when she so utterly was not, while it thrust her and her wishes and intimate knowledge aside as not mattering when, as in the question of more children or no more children, they so utterly did, would on her sole account, on the sole account of what seemed to her at that moment the most profoundly, naturally unimportant thing in life, a woman who had been silly, put a stop to his fine work, and refuse to give the world a chance to profit by his brains. Well, she couldn't think about that now. She couldn't hold on to any of her thoughts for more than an instant. She only knew that the moment had come for facing him, and that she was very tired. She really was extraordinarily tired. Her mind was just as dim and reluctant to move as her body. Whatever Robert was going to do to her, she would cling to him with her arms round his neck while he did it. She was so tired that she thought if he didn't mind her just putting her arms round his neck, she would very likely go to sleep while he beat her. But poor Robert, she thought, how hot it was going to make him to have to be violent, to have to beat. It was not at all good beating weather, and it was almost a pity to waste punishment on somebody too tired to be able properly to appreciate it, to take it, as it were, properly in. She moved along down the path towards the back door. When one came to think of it, it was a strange thing to be going in to Robert to be hurt. Well, but she had deserved it. She perfectly understood about his honour and its needs. Oh yes, she perfectly understood that. A man has to... What had she just been going to think? What does a man have to? Oh well, if only what he did to her could blot out every consequence of what she had done to him, be a full, perfect and sufficient. No, that was profane, tiresome how one thought in the phrases of the prayer book, and how difficult it was if one had had much to do with prayer books not to be profane. As it was, her punishment wouldn't do anybody any good that she could see. Funny, the punishment idea. Of what use was it really? The consequences of the things one did were surely enough in their devastating effect. Why increase devastation? And forgiveness didn't seem to be of much use either. It blotted out the past, she had heard people in pulpits say, but it didn't blot out the future, that daily living among consequences which she perceived was going to be so dreadful. Well, she couldn't think now, and here was the kitchen door, And here, yes, wasn't that Clara staring at her open-mouthed, arrested in the middle of emptying a bucket? Why did she stare at her? Did she then know? "Allmächtige God!" exclaimed Clara, dropping the bucket. Yes, evidently Clara knew, she thought, dragging her dusty feet across the kitchen into the passage. The "Allmächtige God" was what one said in Germany when one's disgraced mistress came back, instead of Guten Tag. Well, it didn't matter. The dark little passage, one almost had to grope one's way along it when the front door was shut. And it had not been aired apparently since she went away, and it was heavy and choked with kitchen smell. She supposed it must be this thickness of atmosphere that made her, on Robert's doormat with her hand on the latch, feel suddenly so very like fainting. And it really was dark. Surely it didn't only seem dark because she suddenly couldn't see. Alarmed, she remembered how she had fainted after her conscience-stricken journey back from Lucerne. Was she then to go through life, making at intervals conscience-stricken journeys back, and fainting at the critical moment at their end? In terror lest she should do it now if she waited a moment longer, and so twist things round in that dishonourable womanly way which commits the wrong and then, bringing in the appeal of bodily weakness, secures the comforting, secures almost the apology, she seized all her courage, swept its fragments together into a firm clutching, and opened the door. Herr Dremmel was at his table writing. He did not look up. "Robert," she said faintly, her back against the door, her hands behind her spread out and clinging to it. "Here I am." Herr Dremmel continued writing. He was, to all appearances, absorbed, and his forehead that hot afternoon was covered with the drops of concentration. "Robert," she said at last, again, in a voice that shook, however hard she tried to keep it steady, "here I am." Herr Dremmel finished his sentence. Then he raised his head and looked at her, staring back at him in misery and fear. And yet beside the fear was a dreadful courage. She recognized the look. It was the look he had when he was collecting his attention, bringing it up from distant deep places to the surface, to herself. How strange that he should at this moment have to collect it, that it did not instantly spring at her, that she and the havoc she had brought into his life should not be soaked into every part of his consciousness. "What did you say, Ingeborg?" he said, looking at her with that so recognizable look. For all her study of him she felt she did not yet know Robert. "I only said," she stammered, that here I was." He looked at her for a further space of silence. Then it flashed upon her that he was dreadfully pretending. He was acting. He was going to torment her before punishing her. He was going to be slowly cruel. Herr Dremmel, as though he were gathering himself together, gathering himself, she thought, watching him and growing cold at his uncanniness for a horrible spring, inquired of her if she had walked. "Yes," said Ingeborg, even more faintly, her eyes full of watchful fear. He continued to look at her, but his hand, while he did so, felt about on the table for a pen he had laid down. She recognized this look too. Amazing, horrible, how he could act. It was the one he had when, talking to somebody, a new illumination of the subject he was writing about came into his mind. She felt sure now that the worst was going to happen to her. But first there was to be torture, a long playing about. These revealed depths of cunning cruelty in him, of talent for cleverest acting. froze her blood. Where was Robert, the man of large simplicities she believed she had known? It was a strange man, then, she had been living with? He had never, through all the years, been the one she thought she had married. "Please," she said, holding out both her hands. "Robert, don't. Won't you be natural?" He still looked at her in silence. Then he said with a sudden air of remembering, "Did you get your boots, Ingeborg?" This was dreadful, that he should even talk about the boots, throw in her face that paltry preliminary lying. "You know I didn't," she said, tears of shame for him that he could be so cruel coming into her eyes. Again Herr Dremmel looked at her as though collecting, as though endeavouring to remember and to find. "I know?" he repeated, after a pause of reflective gazing, during which Ingeborg had flushed vividly and gone white again, so much shocked was she at the glimpse she was getting into inhumanity. It was devilish, she thought. But Robert devilish? Her universe seemed tumbling about her ears. "I think," she said, lifting her head with the pride he ought to have felt and so evidently, so lamentably didn't, "one should give one's punishment like a man." There was another pause, during which Herr Dremmel, with his eyes on her, appeared to ruminate. Then he said, "Did you have a pleasant time?" This was fiendish. Even when acting, thought Ingeborg, there were depths of baseness the decent refused to portray. "I think," she said in a trembling voice, "if you wouldn't mind leaving off pretending oh," she broke off, pressing her hands together. "What's the good, Robert? What's the good? Don't let us waste time. Don't make it worse, more hideous. You got my letter. You know all about it." "Your letter?" said Herr Dremmel. She begged him, she entreated him to leave off pretending. Don't keep on like this," she besought. "It's such a dreadful way of doing it. It's so unworthy." "Ingeborg," said Herr Dremmel, "will you not cultivate calm? You have journeyed and you have walked, but you have done neither sufficiently to justify intemperateness. Perhaps, if you must be intemperate, you will have the goodness to go and be so in your own room. Then we shall neither of us disturb the other." "No," said Ingeborg, wringing her hands. "No, I won't go. I won't go into any other room till you've finished with me." "But, Herr Dremmel, I have finished with you. And I wish," he added, pulling out his watch, "to have tea. I am driving to my fields at 5 o'clock." "Oh, Robert," she begged, inexpressibly shocked. He meant to go on tormenting her indefinitely. "Please, do whatever you're going to do to me and get it over. Here I am only waiting to be punished." "Punished?" repeated Herr Dremmel. "Why?" cried Ingeborg, her eyes bright with grief and shame for this steady persistence in baseness. "Why, I don't think you're to punish me. You're not fit to punish a decent woman. You're contemptible." Herr Dremmel stared. "This," he then said, "is abuse. At least," he added, "it bears a close resemblance to that which in a reasonable human being would be abuse. However, Ingeborg, speech in you does not, as I have often observed, accurately represent meaning. I should rather say," he amended, "a meaning." She moved across to the table to him, her eyes shining. He held his pen ready to go on writing so soon as she should be good enough to leave off interrupting. "Robert," she said, leaning with both hands on the table, her voice shaking, I never thought I'd have to be ashamed of you. I could bear anything but having to be ashamed of you." "Perhaps then, Ingeborg," said Herr Dremmel, "you will have the goodness to go and be ashamed of me in your own room. Then we shall neither of us disturb the other." "You are being so horrible that you're twisting things all wrong and putting me in the position of having to forgive you when it's you who've got to forgive me. Pray then, Ingeborg, go and forgive me in your own room. Then we shall neither of us. You're being cruel. Oh, but it's unbelievable. You, my husband, you're playing with me like a cat with a miserable mouse, a miserable, sorry mouse, something helpless that can't do anything back and wouldn't if it could. And see how you make me talk when it's you who ought to be talking. Do, Robert. Begin to talk. Begin to say things, do things. Get it over. You've had my letter. You know perfectly what I did. I have had no letter, Ingeborg. How dreadful of you to say that, she cried, her face full of horror at him, when you know you have, and you know I know you have. That letter I left for you on this table. I have seen no letter on this table, but I put it here. I put it here. She lifted her hand to point out passionately the very spot to him, and underneath her hand was the letter. Her heart gave one great bump and seemed to stop beating. The letter was where she had put it and was unopened. She looked up at Herr Dremmel. She turned red. She turned white. She tasted the very extremity of shame. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. Herr Dremmel wore a slight air of apology. "One omits occasionally to notice," he said. "Yes," breathed Ingeborg. She stood quite still, her eyes on his face. He pulled out his watch. "Perhaps now, Ingeborg," he said, "you will be so good as to see about tea. I am driving to my fields." "Yes," breathed Ingeborg. He bent over his work and began writing again. She put out her hand and slowly took up the letter. Tradition, copious imbibing of the precepts of bishops, was impelling her towards that action, frequently fatal to the permanent peace of families, the making of a clean breast. Do you want to," she began tremblingly, half holding out the letter. Then her voice failed, and her principles failed, and the precepts of a lifetime failed, and she put it in her pocket. "It's stale," she whispered, explaining. But Herr Dremmel went on writing. He had forgotten the letter. She turned away and went slowly towards the door. In the middle of the room she hesitated and looked back. I'd like to kiss you," she faltered. But Herr Dremmel went on writing. He had forgotten Ingeborg. End of section 16. Recording by James Carson. End of The Pastor's Wife by Elizabeth von Arnim.